facilitator today, Danielle Robinson from Milwaukee Public Schools. Danielle is a math interventionist, and she has been using the habits and tools for about 4 years in her classroom and professional life. She feels that the habits and tools helps her students to develop critical thinking skills as well as helping them develop ownership of their learning and problem solving. Before I turn it over to Danielle, I would also like to introduce Sherry Marlin, our moderator for the webinar today. Sherry is Chief Learning Officer for the Waters Foundation. She writes, speaks, and collaborates with others to apply systems thinking in real-world contexts. She has taught preschool through graduate school and has worked as a building principal and district curriculum specialist. She will be moderating the Q&A portion of the webinar today. So again, thank you everyone for joining. Danielle and Sherry, thank you for sharing with us today. And Danielle, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Awesome, thank you. And I just want to thank you guys so much. Thank the Waters Foundation for allowing me to come on and do this webinar with Math Discourse. And I want to thank all of the participants who have come in. I'm looking forward to definitely doing this webinar with you. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself. So I initially started as a second grade teacher with Milwaukee Public Schools with systems thinking, and this was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and really loved using the habits and the tools in my classroom with my students. And so then I had the opportunity to become a math interventionist. And this is my second year being a math interventionist. And when I began, I really wanted to explore different ways that I can use the systems thinking habits and the tools with my students, especially in mathematics. And so that's kind of what I've been exploring for the past 2 years here. And these are certainly by no means an exhaustive list of things that you can do with your teachers and your students. But these are just some ideas that I've come up with and have found success. And so if you have any ideas that you have found successful, I would love to hear about those, during our Q&A session. And as well as I will have my contact information at the end. So once again, thank you so much for joining, and we'll get started. So today what we're kind of hoping to talk through is I really want to help you understand how to use the tools and the habits to really help teachers understand the importance of mathematical discourse, and also ways that you can actually increase this in your mathematics classroom. So this session is really geared towards teachers in the classroom, but also people who work with teachers as well. So if we take a look at the agenda here, we're going to talk about what is math discourse. We're going to talk about why it's important. We're going to tie discourse to the systems thinking habits. I'm then going to walk you through an exercise that I did with my teachers at my school about their hopes and fears about implementing discourse. And then we're going to talk about where can you actually start. Where do you start in your classroom, or where do you start with teachers to help them understand how to make this happen? Then we're going to go through another activity with a stock and flow. And then I'll end with some more ideas that I've used with my intervention kiddos. So when we're talking about what mathematical discourse is, really what we're talking about is these opportunities for students to be able to share their ideas of their math thinking and how to actually kind of clarify their understandings. We want to help them be able to figure out how to create an argument, why a certain type of problem works or a strategy works. We also want them to be able to develop that language, and that's going to be one of the standards for mathematical practice that we'll talk about, using that precise language. I think one thing that I've learned, especially as an interventionist, is just how important it is for our kiddos to have that math vocabulary. And one thing that's really important is that discourse can really take place in a small group. It can take place with just 2 students as partners, and it can also take place in a whole group. And that last piece there is it's really important for kids to be able to see things from a different perspective. And the reason that I highlighted that is because that literally ties into one of the systems thinking habits. And so I think I just thought that was so awesome. Because really when we look at these habits, it's really integral when we are working with our kiddos and the behaviors that we want to see and the way that we want to help support them in their thinking. So I want to open up just for a question for you. So I know that when I started as a teacher, my first year, I really struggled with having my kids actually talk to each other. I was very much, I wanted things orderly. I wanted them, I felt very nervous about allowing my kids to talk to each other. And so this was something I really struggled with and I was really uncomfortable with when I first started helping understand how to incorporate discourse. So we're going to open up the poll for you, and we just want to have you answer this question, and you'll have a couple different options that you can choose from. So how often do you incorporate discourse in your mathematics classroom? And if you're not directly in the classroom, you could think about what would be ideal for you. Or maybe if you're an administrator, you could answer of how often do you maybe see your teachers incorporating. Okay, so I'm seeing some every lesson, and we're seeing a couple times per week, once per week. All right, awesome, excellent. Thank you guys for participating in that. I just wanted to see where, kind of where we were in that. So we are going, thank you once again for taking that. So we will head on to our next slide here. So we want to talk about why is discourse important in the mathematics classroom? Why is this something that we really want to make sure is happening? And so I'm going to refer to a really great text called Principles to Actions. And this was a book that was put out by NCTM, which is the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And so what this book is it really highlights 8 high leverage teaching practices. So practices that as teachers, what we should be doing in the classroom and how we should be teaching. And so one of those high leverage teaching practices is being able to facilitate discourse among students. And so we really want them to be able to have shared understanding of concepts. We want them to be able to analyze strategies. We want them to be able to compare, and we want them to be able to really have a conversation about strategies and why or why not something works. And so this is a really, really great text if you're looking for more ways to incorporate teaching practices. And this was something that was really, really helpful for me because this book really highlights things that's not how I learned. I really learned a lot of times sitting in my desk in my classroom, working on worksheets, practicing a procedure that my teacher put up on the overhead, and continuing on with my work. And so this was something that I was really uncomfortable with, and this text really helped me with that. Another couple ideas. This is another really great resource called Classroom Discussions in Math, and this was a book that was put out by Math Solutions. And so this book is also another great resource for you, but it also kind of talks about why is talking important. And it really can help reveal when kids have a misunderstanding or they have a misconception. It really helps them to they're boosting their memory because they're working and talking and repeating what each other are saying. It helps them really develop that deeper reasoning. And once again, that language piece comes in. So they're really able to develop that math vocabulary and that precise language to explain their thinking. And then, of course, something that is extremely important is it definitely helps them really develop those social skills. So they have to learn how to take turns when they're having a conversation. They're learning how to disagree in a respectful way with each other. And honestly, when I see my kids really learning how to talk in a respectful way to each other, that honestly improves the whole community in the classroom in general. And so when I started using these practices, it really helped my overall community in my classroom, not just in mathematics. So we're going to take a look at the standards for mathematical practice. So these are 8 standards that were put out by the Common Core math team that are used from K-5 all the way through 12th grade. So these are kind of like the math behaviors that we want to see our students actually being able to do. So we want to see them being able to persevere with problems. We want them to reason abstractly and quantitatively. We want them to be able to construct arguments and be able to critique each other. We want them to be able to model. We want them to be able to use math tools that attend to precision. We want them to be able to make use of structure. And we want them to be able to see patterns, right? So when we're looking at these standards for mathematical practice, the third one, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others, really stands out because that literally is discourse. And so this is something that I always bring up to teachers, is that this is actually something that we should be seeing our kids doing, is they should be communicating with one another. And so what I thought was really great when I started looking at the standards and looking at the habits, I saw a direct correlation between a lot of the habits and the standards for mathematical practice. And so for today, I was just going to highlight some of them. One of the handouts that I gave you is something that I created that by no means is the end all be all, is the perfect example, but I just kind of looked at the standards and then made some connections to other habits. So when you're teaching the habits, you can tie it directly to your standards for mathematical practice. I do see a question. It looks like it says, can you explain, look for, and make use of structure? So an example of that would be students understanding the structure of addition and subtraction. So kind of the relationship that is between them. So what that could mean is that when you are solving a subtraction problem, you might be able to help them understand that they can use addition to solve that. So that would be an example of kind of the structure of mathematics, seeing the relationship between multiplication and division. So that would be an example. Hopefully that kind of answers that question for you. And thank you so much for your questions. I'll try to keep monitoring as we go through here. So going back to the habits, a few of the habits that I thought really directly related to the standard 3, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others, is understanding the big picture. And so when students are able to really communicate, they're understanding the importance of mathematics, right? So I always tell my kids, mathematicians talk about math. And so I really want them to see that they're a mathematician and really see that big picture, that math is something that they can do later in life, and that is always going to be around you. Another habit that I thought really related well to this standard 3 was that changing perspectives to increase understanding. I think that it really screams out at me because a lot of times kids might solve a problem in different ways, and really there's power in kids learning multiple ways of thinking. And so when they're able to actually listen to one another, they can learn other ways to solve problems. Another one was the surfaces and test assumptions. So a lot of times when kids are talking through a strategy, they're maybe not directly sure, like, hey, I don't know if this strategy is actually going to work. And so when they're talking about it, a lot of times they're actually just kind of testing that strategy. They're testing it out. And so that's really important. And that really highlights as well the habit of the successive approximation habit, because I can't even tell you how many times my kiddos will be explaining their thinking and they'll be making a mistake. They'll be, doing it incorrectly, but then they'll be like, oh, wait, no, that's not what I meant. And they'll realize that they made a mistake. And so being able to have that space for them to talk through their thinking actually helps them in their thinking. And then kind of that last one that I thought related really well was the understanding the mental models. And I think that really relates into talking with each other. Sometimes we want our kids to be able to hear each other and also understand where another student is coming from in their thinking and understanding that they're going to think differently. So that really ties nicely into that changing perspective as well. So once again, and I'll go through examples of how I use this with my kids later, but these habits really directly relate to these standards for mathematical practice. And you can use that in your instruction. If you're kind of like, how do I incorporate this into math? The habits and the standards for mathematical practice really fit really nicely together. And by no means is this, like I said, an exhaustive list, but these are just some things that I thought had a really nice connection. So what I wanted to do this year with my teachers is I really saw a need for there to be more discourse and math lessons. And so I had initially done some professional development with them on this teaching practice called Number Talks, which if you've heard of it, that's awesome. If you haven't, we will talk a little bit later about what they are. And I kind of noticed that it was kind of tough for some of my teachers to really jump on the bandwagon for that. And so I really was struggling with trying to figure out how to help my teachers start really wanting to incorporate more discourse. And so I actually spoke with Sherry from Waters Foundation, and she kind of helped me think of this of kind of my next steps. And so she talked about the systems map that was done by the Wash U students in St. Louis, Missouri, and the work that they've done there in the city with the youth there. And so what they did is they created a systems map around kind of a big question, and talked about this idea of hopes and fears. And so I was able to do this with my staff, because I think that a lot of times there are very real reasons why us as educators, why we maybe aren't really keen on trying a new practice. And so I really wanted to understand where my teachers were coming from, because those are very valid reasons why they were struggling with incorporating more discourse. Because I know I've been there where I just was like, I can't do this, my kids can't do this. And so I wanted to make sure that we were addressing those needs that were in our building. And so what we developed is we developed this big question. And so we introduced this big question to the staff, which is, how do we increase discourse in the mathematics classroom? And so this was kind of what I presented with them, that this is what we're trying to figure out. So we're going to work together as a staff, and we're going to figure this out. So what we did next is I asked them this question. I said, when you implement more discourse in your classroom, so when you're taking steps to actually have this happen with your kids, what do you hope will happen? And so what I had them do is I had them go ahead and just take some time, and they just wrote down some ideas of what they hoped would happen either for themselves or what they hoped would happen with their kids. And then I had them actually share out at their tables. So I want to actually give you guys a chance to participate in this as well. So we're going to open up a short answer for you where you can actually type in your answers. So I would like for you to actually answer this question. So when you implement more discourse in your classroom, or maybe when you have your teachers implementing more discourse, what do you hope will happen? So I'll give you some time to type in those answers, and you can certainly do more than one. That is A-okay. And when you have an idea, feel free to go ahead and type that in there. Students will think about equations, absolutely. Students will think more, absolutely. Yes, creating the culture and using talk moves, yes. Yes, definitely those mindsets, absolutely. Oh yes, students being risk takers, so important, absolutely. Yes, awesome ideas. Yep, using those math terms, using that language. Yep, using that precise language. Absolutely. Oh yes, we love aha moments. Those are the best. Absolutely. All right, so I think we will close out the short answer. We just want to keep moving here, but thank you so much for sharing your ideas. Those were great ideas and so important. I'm going to share with you what my teachers came up with for their hopes. And so what we did is I actually had the teachers kind of share at their tables, and then we shared out loud and kind of got all of our hopes out in the open. So what my teachers were hoping is they were hoping that students would listen to each other, they would focus on their learning, they would respect others, they would give and accept that feedback, they would increase their engagement, They would learn the structure of discourse. They would learn those different approaches. They would see that importance of working together. Obviously, that really important idea of understanding math concepts, increasing their think time, having confidence in themselves, their ability to clarify others' thinking, being sensitive to others' thinking, and even learning self-regulation. One thing that I thought was really interesting was my teachers also had hopes for themselves too, which I didn't really anticipate, but I thought this was really cool. So the teachers hoped that they would actually be consistent in their number talks. So what this teacher meant was she said, you know, I try a new practice and I get really excited about it and I'm doing it, and then, you know, life gets in the way and the school schedule gets in the way, and then I kind of fall off. And I'm just hoping that I can actually be consistent and really regulate myself so that I actually continue doing this. They also hope that they would be able to use discourse as a formative assessment. So being able to hear their kids talking and really being able to understand where their kids are at in their thinking. And obviously they wanted to feel more confidence in themselves. So I thought that that was really important, because I know for me, when I first started this out, I really didn't feel confident in my abilities to help kids talk with each other. And so they were really hopeful that they would be able to build their own confidence in themselves to use discourse. So then the next step, what we did is we had everyone go ahead and share out, and then we actually made a behavior over time graph. And so this was another one of your handouts, and you can also just draw a quick little y-axis and x-axis if you have a spare piece of paper. But what I had the teachers do is they picked one variable. So for example, you may pick engagement, and that is going to go on your y-axis. On your x-axis is going to be over time. So some people did, you know, they asked me, how much time are we talking about? Some people did a couple weeks. Some people did over the course of a school year. Some people did, you know, over the course of a couple years if teachers are consistently using discourse in their math lessons. So what I had them do is they made some behavior over time graphs of their hope over time. So I'm going to give you just a moment. This isn't, you know, a poll or anything or a short answer, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to go ahead and make your own behavior over time graph over one of your hopes. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and show you some examples from my teachers. So these are a little hard to see. We put them on pink paper, really bright neon pink paper. But in that very first behavior over time graph, you see that over time, this teacher was hopeful that their students would have a deeper understanding of math concepts. So as you can see, you know, she kind of drew that increasing over time. The one right next to it, this teacher wrote how she wanted them to have, her hope was that her students would have more confidence in themselves over time. So using that discourse in the classroom, she was hopeful that her kids would be more confident in their abilities. And then that bottom example of the behavior over time graph is this teacher wrote about how students actually feel comfortable speaking out and sharing their ideas. And her hope was that over time, more students would feel comfortable. And I actually had a teacher mention to me just recently that she had a very shy little girl in her first grade classroom. And she mentioned that through using discourse and using number talks, which are an example of discourse, her students were feeling, this little girl was feeling more confident in raising her hand and sharing more, which was really awesome to hear. So obviously we just talked about the hopes, but now we're going to talk about kind of the opposite, right? We're going to talk about your fears. It's a very similar question. When you implement more discourse in your classroom, what do you fear will happen? And so I then presented this to my teachers and gave them some time again to just jot down fears that they have about incorporating more discourse. And then they once again had a chance to kind of talk with each other. So I'm going to open this up again to you guys. This will be another short answer. So what are some fears that you have about implementing more discourse? Or if you're an administrator, maybe what do you think your teachers are fearful of happening? So I'll give you some time to go ahead and answer that. Oh, yep, absolutely. Time is always, absolutely. Time is always a real fear, especially in an elementary classroom. Absolutely. Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Having discourse be taken off track. Yep. Students not being respectful. Absolutely. Yep. All very absolute fears that I've had myself. Totally. Give some time for maybe a couple other fears, or maybe people may agree with these, and that may be why. Absolutely. Yeah, not knowing how to respond. Absolutely. Kind of being frozen, right? Especially if you hear a kid sharing something and you have no clue what they said. Absolutely. Yep. Teachers being afraid, not having all the answers. Yep. Administration not understanding what they're doing. Absolutely. These are all very common things that I've absolutely heard, fears that I've had myself. So we'll go ahead and thank you so much again for sharing. We'll go ahead and close that. And what I will do is I'll share with you some of the things that the teachers I worked with, some of the fears that they had. So they were obviously, and you will see that these were very similar to what you also said. Students not being on topic, really fearful that they are going to argue, they'll lose interest, they won't be engaged, maybe they won't understand the concepts. Once again, kind of that lack of respect for others' thinking. So especially if a student is sharing something that is, it's a mistake, kind of that fear that another student will tell them, maybe being disrespectful to them for that. Fearful that students are not buying in to the lesson, and this fear that students will shut down. And I know I personally have had students who have shut down, and I really had to do a lot of work in order to repair that. So very valid things and really real things that will surface when we are incorporating more discourse. So once again, they also had fears for themselves. And they were fearful that the learning goals are not going to be met. If I'm doing this, but we get off track, I'm not going to be able to have my learning goals met. There was a fear of losing control of the classroom. So kind of just this idea of the disrespect and the arguing really taking a toll on the classroom. And teachers said, this is something new that I'm doing. I'm really fearful that I'm going to have more stress. And that's not good for me, and that's not good for my kids. So our next step here, once again, what we did is we took those fears, and I had the teachers create a behavior over time graph of one of their fears. So maybe an example would be you're fearful that there will be more disrespect between students over time. So that might be a behavior over time graph. And so what I'll do is just give you about 10 to 15 seconds if you want to go ahead and either use the template or make another X and Y axis graph on a piece of paper. You can go ahead and take one of those fears and go ahead and make a behavior over time graph. All right, so hopefully that was enough time for you. If you're still thinking, that's okay. I'm going to show you some examples of what the teachers came up with. So that very first pink one that you noticed, this teacher initially, she thought that this was going to be a hope for her. And as she was creating her behavior over time graph, she realized, oh no, this is actually my fear. So she was writing about stress, so teacher stress. So as you can see, at the start of the school year, stress is really, really high. And then over time, it's decreasing. But then At that point at the very bottom there is when she starts number talks. And as you can see, her stress level is going way up. And then towards where it tapers off, that's summertime. So she's like, I'm not stressed in summertime. And so that was something that was really stressful for her, was coming up with a new practice and doing that in the classroom. The one right next to that is fear of disrespect, of students having disrespect for each other. And so as you can see towards the end where it's really, really increasing there, that is when number talks was being implemented. And that last one on the bottom there is this teacher was really fearful of losing control of her students. And so kind of as you can see at the start of the year, you have students starting the year, they're really excited and you're learning procedures and the classroom is functioning, but then she began implementing number talks. And then that's where that control kind of decreases. And so that was something that she was very fearful of. And so after we had teachers, kind of share the story of their graph. So we always had teachers who were comfortable. They shared the story of their graph. And then what we had is we hung a bunch of them up. We hung up the hopes and we hung up the fears. And then I asked them, what is most important to you? And so what I had them do is I had them mark 3 variables that they felt were the most important. And so this could be all hopes that were most important to them. It could be all of the fears that were most important to them. But I just asked them to mark 3 variables. And so this will be another moment. So just maybe think, we're going to share out in a moment. We won't quite get there yet, of you sharing what's the most important to you, but maybe think of what you think is most important when we're talking about increasing discourse. So as you could see, a lot of those behavior over time graphs, you saw a lot of marks on them. And so that was the mark that let me know. A lot of teachers put stars. I've heard of some people using the colorful dots. That's another thing. You can have teachers just stick dots on the behavior over time graph. So the most important variables that my teachers decided to pick was they were hopeful that students would increase their confidence. They were hopeful that students would increase in their respect for others. They were hopeful that they would increase their understanding of math concepts over time, and that they would be able to ignore attention-seeking behaviors. So those were the hopes that received the most votes. The most important variables for fears, and as you could see on that loss of control behavior over time graph, there was lots of stars on there. So that was a really big fear for my teachers, was kind of that losing control or feeling as though you're losing control. They were fearful of off-task behavior increasing, that disrespect of each other increasing, and then students shutting down. So I want to actually open this up to you guys. And actually have you share what variable or factor is most important to you when we're talking about increasing discourse. And like I said, this can either be a hope or this can be a fear. And this is another short answer, so you can go ahead and type that in as well. Nice, building off each other's ideas, absolutely. Student-centered and initiated engagement, absolutely. All right, so we can go ahead and we'll close that poll. Oh, yep, thinking critically. Love, yep, absolutely. I think that is really crucial, is actually discourse really helps our kids really think about what they're saying. Absolutely. So we'll go ahead and we'll close that poll because I want us to be able to kind of, talk about kind of the next steps here and what we did next. So we'll go ahead and close that. All right, so where I went from there is I took all of this, these ideas from the teachers that I work with, and I really thought to myself, okay, what are the next steps? Because I really wanted to address the issues that my teachers were raising in terms of their hopes, but as well as their fears. So I really began to think about a lot of resources that I've used in the work that I do, and obviously you'll be familiar with the Principles to Actions text from NCTM. There's also the Classroom Discussions in Math from Chapin, which is also another really great resource talking about talk moves. A couple other ones that I want to point out is there's this text at the bottom here called Taking Action. And that is another text from NCTM put out by two authors. Deanne Hinker is one of them. And this was really written in response to Principles to Actions. So Principles to Actions had these 8 high leverage teaching practices, but then a lot of teachers kind of had this criticism, okay, great, but what does this look like? And what does this look like in a classroom? And so they came out with Taking Action, and this is actually, there's a pre-kindergarten through 2nd grade, there's a 3rd through 5th version, there is a 6th through 8th grade version, and I think there's even a high school version. And they break down these teaching practices and actually give you lesson ideas, and they help you understand of what to actually do. So there's a whole section in here on discourse. There's also this great book from Sherry Parrish called Number Talks, which is a book that I've been using with the teachers that I work with. Once again, we'll talk a little bit more about what number talks are. We could probably do a whole webinar on what number talks are as well. But we will touch just a little bit on those. The other book you'll see down here is The 5 Practices. And that's another book that helps you kind of organize your math discussions. And then, of course, using the habits, the habits of the systems thinker text that was put out by Waters Foundation, which has been really helpful for me in how to think about the habits and think about how to incorporate that, not only with my teachers, but also with my students. So what I did is I really looked at these texts and I really thought about, okay, what do we need to do to help my teachers feel comfortable with this? So we did some professional development. And so kind of the 4 big areas that we did professional development on was helping teachers learn how to create a mathematics community, learning how to do number talks, learning how to do talk moves, which is from that classroom discussion text. And unfortunately, we won't be able to really talk about that today due to time. But if that's something that you're interested more in, you can reach out to me or contact me, and I can give you more resources or ideas. And then using systems thinking habits and tools actually in the classroom to address using discourse with your kiddos. And so the first thing that we talked about is really, okay, where do I start? How do I actually build a math community? And so a couple ideas that I came up with was actually talking with the students and talking about the importance of respecting answers and the thinking of others, and actually having them work together to come up with ways that we can make sure that that's happening in the classroom. Because oftentimes what I found is my kids, when I'm talking to them about being respectful to each other, they understand that, and they're much more willing to do that when there's a structure around it. We also talk about what's the importance of talking about math. And so that was also really crucial for my kids to actually have that opportunity to talk about that. I also had them really learn how to do a turn and talk. So I think I have this colleague who talks about how when we're talking with our little kids that nothing is trivial and nothing is obvious to them. And so I think sometimes we actually have to take those steps to actually teach them how to do a procedure, actually how to turn and talk, and actually how to teach them what active listening is. And we practice a lot. And so I, went through that with the teachers and actually went into classrooms and helped them practice that. But I think one thing that's really important is our really important first step is to actually build that classroom community, because I think when we have that concern of students being disrespectful of each other, we have to make sure that we have that strong mathematics community. And so I actually was able to help teachers by going in and help them kind of start that and start building that math community. So one of the things that I do in my classroom is we have math talk expectations. And we could honestly probably call this math expectations. And so these are 6 things that are kind of non-negotiables in our room. And I've actually had other teachers use them in their classrooms too. But number 1, we are all mathematicians and we treat each other with respect. We also talk about how we keep trying even when problems are hard. And so we definitely talk about those mindsets as well. We definitely have conversations about the growth mindset. We participate and we show others that we're listening. So that's where that active listening piece really comes in. We talk about how making mistakes is really vital and how it's okay to change our thinking. And then that last piece is really learning how to share our ideas and ask good questions. So these are things that have really helped me when I've been creating that math community, and what I've actually brought into other classrooms with other students that have really helped them understand that we're all in this together and we have to respect each other, and that's how we're going to grow, and that's how we're going to become better mathematicians. So the next piece of our kind of learning about how to generate a mathematics community was I did a activity with my teachers with a stock and flow. So I wasn't sure of how familiar people were with the stock and flows. And so I gave you a little graphic on here of a tub. And so when you think about a stock and flow, you have a stock, which is the water in the tub. So you have something, the stock is either increasing or it's decreasing. And you have things that cause it to increase and you have things that cause it to decrease. So if we're looking at the tub, the inflow, right, so turning on that faucet and having the water fill that tub up, that's causing that water to increase. But then you also have that outflow. You have the drain, right, that's going to cause that stock to leave. And so what we did is we actually talked about how we can increase discourse in the classroom. And so what I had them do is they created a stock and flow, which was just like a huge rectangle in the middle, and they had their inflow and their outflow. And I had them discuss with each other what were things that teachers can do and what students can do that will have an increase of discourse in the classroom. And then what can teachers do and what can students do that will actually cause a decrease in the classroom. So I had the teachers discuss this first, and then they started creating a huge chart of their stock and flow. And I have some examples too, if you're kind of curious of what that looks like. So then once we gave them that time to do that, then they discussed what teachers can do that will increase discourse, what can students do that will increase that discourse, but also what are those things that will cause that discourse to decrease. So the next step to this activity was we read an article called Creating Math Talk Communities, which is from a NCTM journal called Teaching Children Mathematics. And what this really focused on is actually helping teachers understand things that they can do to really create that math community in their classroom. And so they're really big, 4 big components. So number 1 was just talking with your students about why talking about math is important. That's one really vital step, so kids know that it's important. The second piece was actually teaching them how to listen to each other and how to respond to each other. So it actually went through active listening and what active listening was and how you show your peer or your colleague, right, that you are listening to them and taking in what they're saying. That third piece was introducing sentence stems, which I also have some examples for you later. And then the last kind of big topic was having students understand what an explanation is and what justification is. And so kind of what I gathered from this article is that explaining is really just kind of walking through a procedure of what you did, but justification is really explaining why you did what you did. Why did you solve a strategy this way? And what's more powerful is that justifying piece for kids. So I'm going to go ahead and show you some examples of some stock and flows. So this is an example. So we've got those two different colors of teacher actions and student actions. And so some things that cause an increase is that enthusiasm, right? So if a teacher is really enthusiastic, that will cause that discourse to increase. Students' interest will cause an increase. A teacher being comfortable with discourse, that will cause an increase, right? Using those sentence stems, that will help that increase. But then we also have those things that will cause a decrease. So maybe students are really struggling with paying attention. That will decrease that. Maybe there's a lack of resources. That might cause a discourse to decrease. Maybe the teacher isn't actually comfortable, so that might cause it to decrease. Or time. Time was something we talked about earlier. You just don't have the time to be able to have those discussions. This is another example from the teachers. So we also see those examples of actually teaching them to turn and talk. That will help that increase. But then we might see that students are laughing at each other. So that would probably cause a decrease because students don't feel safe that they can share their thinking. This is another example. So this one's a little bit harder to see, but once again, kind of those ideas, there's modeling. So actually modeling how to talk and how to listen, that will help that increase. Teachers providing feedback. And providing them actually the things that students should be asking each other. That will cause that increase. That encouragement and motivating from both the teacher and students, that will help students increase their talking. The idea of what will decrease, not knowing the procedures, right? Afraid that they might get a question wrong. Absolutely. A lot of times I know that when I was a kid, I certainly was not going to share my thinking if I thought that if I wasn't really sure what I was saying. And so we have to continue to work to create that safe environment so that kids can be risk takers. So this is an example of some sentence stems, and I know a lot of times in literacy they're used as well. I use them in my classroom with my kiddos, and these are really the basic sentence stems that I use to start off the year, just to get my kids kind of familiar with how to start their talking. So automatically we practice every time you share your thinking, you say, my strategy is, and then you share your strategy. We also talk about agreeing with someone and saying, I agree with you because, or I disagree with you because. And I always praise them when they disagree respectfully. We get very excited about that because we want to understand that disagreeing is okay. We just have to do it in a respectful way. And also this idea of being able to say, okay, well, I agree with this, but I still have a question about this. And so I use these 4 sentence stems probably the most with my kids that they're most comfortable with. This is another example of discourse that I did with my kiddos. So I used this back when I was a 2nd grade teacher. So we were really having a hard time listening to each other. So what I had them do is they worked with partners. And so partner A shared their strategy. And they said, my strategy is, and partner B was to listen and then repeat it back. So say, okay, I hear you saying that. And then they would switch because I really wanted them to practice actually listening to each other. And one way that you show someone you listened is that you actually repeat it back. And so this was something that we practice, and I actually do this with my intervention students now as well. So another professional development that I did with my teachers was talking about number talks. And so what number talks are, we don't have enough time to really go in depth of what they are, but they really are just about 10-minute, a little mini activity, mental math activity, where you literally provide the students with a problem and they solve it mentally in their head, and then they share out their thinking of what they did. And then as the teacher, you kind of just jot down, you chart what their answers are and what their thinking was. And then you have the kids kind of discuss the answers and strategies. There's lots of resources out there. If it's something you're interested in, feel free to contact me. It's something that I really believe in. They were developed by Ruth Parker and Kathy Richardson, and they were really developed to help students with their discourse, but also with developing their fluency. And so it's something that was really important to help students really work on those addition facts, those subtraction facts, multiplication, division, and there's actually some work out there with fractions as well. And so what's really great is they can practice in a low pressure setting. So a lot of times when I was a kid, I took those time tests, and I hated those time tests. They made me so nervous, and so this is kind of another way that teachers can see where their students are in a low pressure setting. And it really works great with having kind of those mixed ability groupings, because your kids who are struggling can hear what other students are doing to kind of help them with concepts. One thing I did want to show you is these are all of the fluency standards, K-5 through 5th grade, which in every grade there is a fluency standard. So number talks not only help with that discourse and helping kids to be able to learn how to talk to each other and learn to share their thinking, but it also helps them build that fluency within their number sense. So like I said, I can definitely provide more resources to you if you're interested. Like I said, I'll have my email at the end here. One thing, kind of this last little bit of ideas that I've been exploring has been really talking about the habits with my students and really bringing the systems thinking habits and tools into my math interventions, especially when talking about discourse. And so what we did with the habit changes perspective to increase understanding is we first really discussed what did that habit mean. And so I had the kids really looking at the picture, and we really broke it down of what they thought was going on. And then we talked about what perspectives were. And so really understanding that you're hearing, where someone else is coming from. And then we talked about how did that actually relate to math. And so kids were like, oh, like a lot of times I can learn from so-and-so strategy. I can learn from what Jonas said, or I can learn from what Talea said. And then I actually had them give examples of when they've actually used that habit. So what we do is we also write about why this habit is important. So I have some student writing for you, and it's a little hard to read, so I'll read it for you. I can translate it, from kid writing. So this student wrote that this habit is important because it helps us learn math. It helps us listen to each other. It helps us remember math because we practice and we say it over and over. And we share our strategies, which is very true because I do make them really, I go, can anyone say what Talea said? Can you repeat what Talea said? So I actually make them say things over and over to help them remember. This student said, this habit is important because it helps us and listen to each other. And so I thought that was really great because really what we want to do, right, is we want to help our kids be able to really listen to each other. And I think sometimes as adults, we really struggle listening to each other. And so this was really cool to see. And I also really enjoyed how he tried to draw the habit picture as well. I thought that was really cool. This last little piece here is I also have used a causal loop, a reinforcing loop with my students about why should we talk about math. And so we kind of break this down. And I have, obviously I have this loop in my mind, but we kind of work and generate this together. And so what we talk about is how a student will share their math strategy. And so because we listen to that student, we'll learn a new way to solve the problem. And because we know how a new way to solve the problem, we get really excited about math. And because we're really excited about math, we'll either want to listen to our peers, or we'll want to share our math strategy, and then we'll learn another new way to solve the problem, or we'll help someone else find a new way to solve the problem. And then we continue to get excited about math. So we really talk about these loops, and we have several loops that we talk about in our classroom. We have a perseverance loop as well. This is our talking loop, and we talk about how these are really good loops that we want to really live in and what we really want to do. And so this is another way that you could introduce this idea to students to really help them buy into buy into discourse. So one thing that I want to kind of end on is, what do our kids think about discourse? I think, we have kind of our ideas about discourse, but what do our kids actually think about when we force them to talk to each other? And so I did this with some of my intervention students, and I just said to them, I asked them the question, I said, why is talking about math important? And so this was some of their thinking. So this student said, she said, you get to talking about math and it is better to me. I get on task and you'll know how to read the math problem, and it will probably be words you never knew, and now I know the words. I like it because you'll get pride and your brain will get bigger. So you should love math. It is a joy and I love it so much. This student said, I asked the same question, why is talking about math important? Math is important so you can learn math, so that we can be mathematicians, and so when you grow up, you can be a teacher. I am a mathematician. And this last one is because you can do special things. It can help you get more help. I love it, and it helps you learn more about math. You can do your best and get better at math. And I am a mathematician, and you are too, and your brain is growing. And I think one thing that I've really taken away from my kids and the teachers that I work with is that we want our kids to feel as though they're capable, and we want them to feel as though they are mathematicians, or they are scientists, or they are readers, or they are writers. And I have found that really incorporating discourse is something that really helps them feel successful, and it really helps them feel like a community when they are working together, and they begin to understand that, we're not going to get anywhere by ourselves. We have to work together. And so that's been something that's been really powerful for me. And that's why discourse is something that I'm really passionate about, and something that I really want to continue to get better at with my kids. And so as we close here, I just was hoping to kind of hear from you. We'll have another little short answer here that we're going to open up for you. And just, what is one thing that you can take away from today to incorporate more discourse? And maybe, it's an idea from here, or maybe this has helped you really start thinking about other ideas, because, in teaching, we are in constant collaboration, and I want to learn from you guys as well. So any ideas that you would like to share, that would be awesome. So we'll open that up for you, and just type in one thing that you can take away that you would like to incorporate, either with the teachers that you work with or with your kids.
Danielle, this is Sherry. And
Hi.
before we, hi. And so before we start reading off some of those takeaway responses, we had a
Yes.
question earlier on that I think
Sure.
would
Oh,
be
I'm
great for you to
sorry.
speak to. That's okay. Could you talk to us a little bit about how teachers specifically use discourse for formative assessment, and how that
Yes.
may give them a
Yes.
more holistic picture of their students?
Yeah, so one thing that I've seen done, and things that I've been exploring with, so there are strategies, right, that we want our kids to develop when they're adding and subtracting. So I'm going to speak to adding and subtracting because that's kind of where I live right now. And so we have different strategies that kids can use when they're solving addition and subtraction. So we have what's called level 1 thinking, which is where our kids they're counting everything. So if I say 2 plus 2, they'll go 1, 2, and then they'll go 1, 2, and then they'll count everything. So that's level 1. Then level 2 is that counting on. So if I say 2 plus 2, they'll say, oh, I started at 2 and I went 3, 4. So that's a level 2 thinking. Where we want our kids to eventually be is level 3. And so level 3 is where they're using facts that they already know. So if you've heard of making a 10 strategy, or using your doubles, so what Number Talks actually does is you can present particular problems that will push kids to those strategies. And so what I will actually do is I will take notes. If I have noticed that one of my kids who has been counting on forever, if I present the problem, 5 plus 6, and my kiddo goes, oh, I know that 6, you can break that apart into a 5 and a 1, and I can do 5 plus 5, which is 10, and add one more, that's 11. And boom, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I want that child to do. So I will make a quick anecdotal note, or I've seen people who have charts with like their class names on there, and they'll just say, oh, that student knows making a 10. And so that really helps you understand how your kids are progressing. Hopefully that answers that question a little bit.
Yes, I appreciate that. And please feel free as you're typing your close to type in some more Q&As. I did post in the question and answer a link that Brett shared related to the
Oh,
book by
awesome.
O'Connor, that also one that she has on a Talk Science primer. And we'd actually had a private chat about science specifically. So just that resource is there in the Q&A as well.
Nice, excellent. So some takeaways. It looks like behavioral time graph. Awesome. Yep, those are doing the hopes and fears was really helped me a lot, especially to know where my teachers were coming from. Yep, and the stock and flow, absolutely. So, and actually, I haven't had a chance to do that stock and flow this year. I did it last year with my kids of, what's going to have our discourse increase, what's going to have it decrease. But that is definitely something that you can do with kids too, as well as teachers. Absolutely.
And those two, I think those two responses, Danielle, for me really bring to mind that the systems, tools, and habits are there to support, that the mathematical discourse is a best
Oh,
practice.
totally.
It's a pedagogy, math is the
Hmm.
content, but the systems tools just, uh, they're not an extra thing, but they're really tools that help make those things happen.
Absolutely. And that's one thing, especially when I started as the math interventionist, and I really hadn't done a lot of work with the tools and habits specifically in math. It was always in science and in literacy and in writing. And so what I've really found, though, is that the habits and the tools really help support those high leverage teaching practices. And so that's been really helpful for me and things that I'm still exploring. So
Well, thank you. We have used all of our time. I want to thank you, Danielle, as always. It's a delight to hear you just share what you are doing there in Milwaukee with your students and now with the staff at Brown Street. And we really appreciate your time. And we'll turn it back over to Ronnie to close us out.
yes. Thank you guys so much for participating with me. I appreciate all the ideas that people shared. Thank you so much.